Going to the grocery store is something many of us do weekly. Food is accessible and relatively affordable in Canada compared to the rest of the world. Have you thought about how that could change? In a recent poll, over half of Canadians ranked global warming or climate change as one of their top 5 life concerns. There's plenty of data to suggest that climate in Canada is already changing, something our farmers know firsthand. Intense rainfall and more frequent and severe storms can cause soil erosion and flooding. Higher temperatures can introduce pests, and drought can lead to fires and water scarcity. But there's good news. Our food system is resilient. Do you know why? Farmers and the food system are continuously adapting agricultural practices. The goal is to lessen the impact of climate change on our food production and reduce agriculture's carbon footprint. How are science and technology being used to ensure the sustainability of our food system in Canada?
So first of all, science and technology, like if we look to the past, science and technology has played a huge role in increasing how much crop yield we can get from a unit of land, for example. And that's a really important concept because that means we have to use less land to produce food for people in the world. Therefore, we can dedicate more area for conservation, for that biodiversity, and so on. So in terms of sustainability and going forward, science and technology has produced crops that are very productive per land area. It has produced equipment that allows us to apply, let's say, fertilizer in a more efficient way. So overall, all of that know-how is being used not just to improve production for farmers to have a better bottom line, but also to protect the environment in certain cases. So for example, the use of no tillage, it's a practice that it's really prevalent now in Western Canada because the climate is very conducive for the use of no-till. So that has saved on fuel because there's less passes that farmers have to do. They used to work the land before planting. No-till basically means you don't have to till the soil. So anybody that's a gardener knows that you have to kind of mix up the soil before you put in the seed. Well, equipment was developed that allows us to place the seed in a small furrow and not have to work up all the land. So it's very targeted. And that has been basically put in place because we now have herbicides. So they kill the weeds by spraying as opposed to by cultivating. So that is, again, a way that science and technology has allowed for use of a practice that is good for soil health, that improves carbon sequestration, and also helps the farmer's bottom line because they don't spend as much on field operations.
Growing a bushel of corn today takes 40% less land, 40% less energy, 50% less water, and produces 35% less greenhouse gases compared to growing a bushel of corn in the 1980s. Can you explain how the food industry is diversifying its agriculture across the board, and why is biodiversity important in agriculture?
Biodiversity is really important for a number of reasons. One is related to, if you look at across Canada, we've got a lot of different ecosystems, right? We've got different levels of rainfall, different times of sunlight, different temperatures, the seasonal length, the growing seasons differ. We need that diversity in order to have crops that'll grow across the country, just because of the differences in ecosystems that we have within Canada. So that's one really important reason. The other is related to the change that we're experiencing when it comes to climate change. We need to have that genetic diversity, and so that we have both livestock and plant genetics that are capable to adapt to those changes that we're seeing, whether it be increases in temperature, increased disease risk, because we're seeing some of the vectors that previously were only in the southern states moving up into northern Canada because of those higher temperatures. So having that gene pool that can be selected from, whether it be for increased disease resistance, increased yield, or other quality factors that we might be looking for, is really important to enable to have that flexibility to meet those challenges.
And how does biodiversity in agriculture help protect soil, land, and even our crops from potential disasters stemming from climate change?
We need a variety of different crop types in order to maintain soil health. So just monoculturing the same crop over and over each year will result in a depletion of soil quality. So we will use rotational systems where we'll grow, for example, potatoes one year, corn the next, and then a legume like alfalfa or another legume that fixes nitrogen and helps restore the soil health in terms of the nutrients that are retrieved or returned back to the soil that were basically harvested in the previous crop that was grown in the previous year. So all of those are important in maintaining soil health. Another really important factor in terms of soil health is the use of livestock manure. So it's really important to realize that we need integrative, both cropping and livestock systems in order to have sustainable agriculture in Canada. And manure, unlike chemical fertilizer, has organic matter already in it. So as soon as you apply manure to the soil, you're increasing the organic matter levels within those soils. If we're talking native grasslands, those are the same grasslands that have been here for millennia. They've basically evolved since the last ice age. And so the plants and that are growing out there are the same plants that were here during that ice age time. And when you look at what role cattle play, cattle have basically replaced the role that the bison played on the grassland ecosystems. So they make a very important work by that. Grazing is really important for plant health. It promotes plants. Those plants evolved over millennia with that grazing pressure. So that's part of their natural evolution that they underwent during that period of development. At the same time, that promotes diversity in the grassland ecosystems as well, such as seed dispersal and that, in the manure, that's a really important part as well in terms of the role that the cattle play. And then there's also huge quantities of carbon. There's very large quantities of carbon that are stored within those grasslands, much larger than what's in cultivated lands that are used for crop production. Whenever we basically disrupt grasslands through cultivation, we immediately cause a huge release of carbon from that ecosystem. And so a lot of the strategies that they're doing now in cropping systems is to try to recover that carbon back.
In addition to championing sustainable practices, the food system is also working on reducing its CO2 emissions, the major cause of greenhouse gases. Agriculture accounts for about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Emissions come from sources such as methane from livestock, synthetic fertilizers, and fuel for farm equipment, as well as food that's spoiled. How is the food system reducing its CO2 emissions?
Probably the greatest improvement is related to conservation of soil carbon. Every time we undertake a disturbance of the land, we emit CO2. So zero tillage is one tillage per year. Basically, they seed directly into the stubble from the previous year. That will reduce the amount of carbon that's released versus multiple tillages. In the past, we used a situation called summerfall, where the land was left barren and cultivated to control weeds. So we relied a lot more on cultivation to control weeds than what we do now. And that resulted in greater release of carbon. The other factor that there's a lot of emphasis on now is looking at reducing the amount of emissions that come from fertilizer. And from fertilizer, it's mainly nitrous oxide. Of course, there's also greenhouse gas emissions during the production of fertilizer, so we use fossil fuels as well to produce fertilizer when it's originally manufactured. So there's a footprint associated with that as well. So one thing we can do is increase the efficiency of nitrogen utilization. So make sure that the crop captures more of that nitrogen and less of that nitrogen is emitted as nitrous oxide.
What are some of the more innovative farming practices that are being experimented with or being used by farmers?
A lot of them are striving towards improved efficiency. So less investment of nutrients, that are going into the system, and more of those nutrients being captured by the end product. So that doesn't matter whether you're talking about an animal or a crop. What we're trying to do is maximize the amount of nutrients that we provide into the system that are captured by that individual food product at the end of the day. So for example, in crop production, there's a lot of precision agriculture going on now. So precision application of fertilizers, making sure you're only applying enough fertilizer to meet the crop requirements. And that may vary even within a field, right? So when you're talking about differences in topography, the fertilizer requirements might be different from the top of the hill versus in the valleys. And so getting to the point where that fertilizer is applied differentially based on what the crop requirements are. So GPS is a big part of that, global positioning system, so that they can tell where they are in the field, where the topography differs, and where, you know, greater or less fertilizer application could be benefit. They're also using a lot of satellite imagery in that to predict crop health, crop types, you know, and that can be related then to droughts or some of the climate change events that we're talking about as well, where crops will require different levels of fertilizer depending upon growing conditions.
What about cattle and grazing?
We really see cows in those grassland ecosystems as being what we call the keystone species. So they play a really important role, and they are interconnected through the food web to a variety of different other organisms that live within that ecosystem. So an example of that in terms of cattle would be the manure that's produced, okay? So they're capable of digesting that grass. That converts the manure into a form that's more readily usable by insects like dung beetles and that. Those dung beetles and other insects then serve as a food source for birds. So that's a lot of our grassland birds depend upon that as a food source. There may be seeds in that in there, so that's a source of food for rodents. Rodents attract snakes, you know, or raptors when we talk about hawks or owls and that. So really it plays a really important role. Even the hair from the cattle are used in the nests of the rodents and in birds as well. So it just shows you how integrated the system is. And if you remove cattle from that ecosystem, you're going to have a negative impact on those other species as well.
When many consumers hear the words synthetic fertilizer and synthetic pesticides, they automatically think they are bad things. Are they?
Well, not necessarily. I think it's all in how these products are used. The synthetic part of it, it means that we use some perhaps fossil fuel chemistry to produce it. So that is definitely not positive environmentally, because there are emissions associated with the production of those products. However, there are big efforts in bringing in science and technology again to replace the fossil fuel sources with renewables. But the products themselves, for example, if we think of synthetic fertilizer, it's really an inorganic source. If you don't have that, then you have to use an organic source like manure. So we do encourage, and there are lots of efforts to recycle some of those organic nutrients and not treat them as waste. So when farmers apply manure, they're basically recycling nutrients. But there are a lot of situations where you don't have that source of organic materials, and in that case you have to supplement and use synthetic products. The use of synthetic fertilizer, herbicides and pesticides, improved seeds that have been bred through either genetic modified seeds or other types of approaches, it basically means that we can produce a lot more food per area compared to the alternative. And what that allows us then is to, the term is used, land sparing. So you spare land from production. So that means you can dedicate that land to wetlands, to conservation efforts, to biodiversity. There have been calculations done that say, well, if we didn't use all these products, you know, we would need to have much larger areas to produce the same amount of food, because per unit land of area, the production would decrease. So I think in themselves, the synthetic products are not a bad thing. They have allowed us to produce an enormous amount of food and not have to deforest to get to that production. But at the same time, we also have to step back a bit, and there are a lot of innovative farmers that are doing that, to use what they're calling like regenerative agricultural practices, which is really the idea that you rely more on soil biology. So you rely on some of those natural processes, but you're not just leaving it for nature to decide. You actually manage it in a way to get the best benefits from the soil.
Healthy soil is vital for our crops and the environment.
In terms of soil carbon, there's kind of two main things. One is trying to keep the carbon that's already there, keep
Sequestered
it there,
there.
and or doing something that increases that amount. So by growing additional crops or by using a practice like no tillage, some of the carbon that's in the air can be tied up in the soil. Now, an important aspect of this is that it's not the permanence of it. So it will be tied up in the soil, but if something is done, just like with our forests that are burning now, that carbon will be released again. So there are efforts to sort of try to consider that in the equation in terms of how much carbon can be stored in the soil and for how long. So that's one of the gases. In terms of nitrous oxide, that is more of an immediate effect, meaning if a farmer manages their nitrogen fertilizer in an improved way in a given year, that impact is immediate. If we're thinking of CO2 kind of going into the soil, in the case of nitrous oxide, think of an arrow leaving the soil, and then our efforts there are to reduce the size of that arrow, meaning the emissions are not as large as they are.
We rely on the top 12 inches or 30 centimeters of soil to produce food for ourselves and export around the world. We should think about how we can balance our soil's ability to produce as much food as possible from an acre of land without harming the ability of future generations to do the same.
A lot of innovative farmers, they're using cover crops, they're using no-till, they're diversifying their rotation, they're using manure, because manure is a good source of carbon, to basically improve soil health. Because soil health is a term that it encompasses qualities of the soil in terms of biology, in terms of physical properties, in terms of chemical properties. But the one really strong indicator is soil organic matter. So if we have a soil that has higher soil organic matter, for the most part, it will also be a healthy soil. So how do we get increased organic matter, which basically organic matter is mostly made up of carbon, is that we add more biomass to the soil. And the good thing in all of these is that soil erosion is really when we have water falling in the soil and taking the soil away. So how do we prevent that is by covering the soil. So some of the things that I talked about, no tillage, cover crops, are really about preventing that water from carrying the soil away by protecting the surface with the plant material.
And in terms of climate change, how does that make our food system more resilient when farmers are doing all that you've explained?
Mm-hmm. So the good things are like these practices, they also protect the system from big changes or shocks. So we talk about a system being resilient, more resilient. In the case of farming, farm fields deal with a lot of stuff. For example, a big rainfall that happens, a month rainfall in 1 hour, or very dry conditions and hot conditions. So the soil is like a buffer system. With increased soil organic matter, we have better capture of water, we have better retention of water in the soil. So research has shown that with these practices that improve soil health, we also get the benefit of more stable yields over time, meaning we don't get those big hits because in this particular year it was too dry and there was just not enough water available for plants. Or in this particular year it rained a lot and my seed washed away and the yields were much less because of that. So that is, in a way, we talk about climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation, and really those meet in terms of the practices that farmers are using or can use. It's like you're storing more carbon, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time you're making the system more resilient to the effects of climate change.
We've talked about extreme weather events and how they impact the food system, the importance of sustainability, reducing greenhouse gases and improving soil health. But there are other aspects of climate change as well. One is the need for our food system to remain profitable. Our farmers and food companies wouldn't stay in business otherwise, and we would have to rely more on imports to feed ourselves. Did you know that less than 1% of the population is involved in primary agriculture? About 250,000 people grow food for 40 million people. How do we do it?
Well, we've really had a huge level of mechanization curve since the 1940s in all of agriculture, in both livestock and crop production. And we see farms getting larger and larger as we get economies of scale. And as the equipment's gotten, that much bigger, they can seed that much faster and harvest that much quicker. So all of those things have really reduced the number of people that it takes because of that mechanization. And we're probably even going to see more of that. There's an emphasis on moving into robotics, robotic-driven tractors, so that they will be self-driven and you won't even need the individual to drive the tractor as well.
Another aspect of sustainability that's overlooked is the far-reaching social benefits Canadians gain from a profitable food system. For example, many social benefits are partially funded by taxes paid throughout the food industry. Canada has free basic education through to high school, a network of roads that connects the country, and world-class Medicare.
Why is it so important to our economy that Canada's food system remain a profitable one?
Oh, definitely. I mean, farmers, they are good stewards of the land, but they are not doing it for charity. I mean, I think we all have this idea of the old McDonald's farm and, a very romantic vision of farming. And that is okay if that's your hobby. But if you're trying to make a business and a living out of it, then you need to put your best tools and your best team forward. I've been at farms where I've been really impressed with the level of technology, like farmers running 10,000 acres, a family farm of 5 people running that type of operation with huge machinery, huge investments. And again, it's a business. It's not, that's why people are in it. But at the same time, it's those 3 pillars of sustainability where you have the social well-being and economics, the environment. Sustainability is not just about the environment. It's also about having the farms be profitable in the long run. And also the social aspects, like the social well-being of rural communities and so on. Sometimes people look at it and say, well, it's all about the money. Well, no, it's not exactly all about the money. There's also, the aspects of stewardship and so on. But I've heard farmers say it's hard to be green when you're in the red. And I think that that's a really good saying. Now, can it be improved? I think everybody agrees, even in the agriculture sector, and there are a lot of efforts to improve the practices that farmers do, and even the income of farmers, because if you talk with a lot of farmers, they often say how they're struggling with the high input costs. They also have costs that they have to cover, like increase in the fertilizer costs and seed costs and so on. So all in all, I think for consumers to understand how the food system in Canada works is a really important thing.
Our food system is evolving. It's driven by a shared commitment to a more sustainable future in the face of climate change. It's a joint effort involving farmers, scientists, policymakers, and consumers. We can do our part by supporting local agriculture and reducing our food waste. Let's recognize the impacts of climate change on food production and support the food system on its path of continuous improvement.